Hello, this is Todd Luck, and this is a spoiler review of Masters of the Universe Revolution from a lifelong Masters of the Universe fan of 40 years. I'm a huge fan of the franchise, and I loved last season, which was Masters of the Universe Revelation, and I definitely had some very mixed feelings about this new season. I've definitely had a lot of mixed feelings about where they've been taking the story in the franchise for the last 10 years. It's a very top-down kind of storytelling where Mattel will dictate the ideas and the directions of the comics and the cartoons, so we keep seeing the same ideas over and over again. And those ideas tend to be about convoluted, cliched things that shoehorn in all kinds of Easter eggs and references to old stuff. And sometimes it just doesn't really feel right for the characters and rarely explores much of the cast or their world. And I think this stuff comes from a sincere place of love, but I just disagree with it. To me, the big draw of Masters of the Universe has always been the fascinating world that they live in that was always so fun to explore, filled with all of these interesting characters. And when you go back and look at Filmation or the 2002 series, almost every episode, you were meeting new characters, going new places, finding new magical artifacts, fighting new monsters, and I always wanted to see that done in a modern comic or TV series. And then DreamWorks did a show that did exactly that with She-Ra. They fleshed out her supporting cast, they explored her world, and it was great. It felt like they just found some talented showrunners who were inspired by the source material and just let them create something really good. And I was hoping that Mattel TV could create a He-Man show that was equal to that or better in scope and quality. And then we got Revelation, which did that with Masters of the Universe. Now, there were still a lot of those recycled Mattel story ideas, right, that we saw in the comics and that we would see again in the CGI series. But the difference here was that they were able to weave them together in a way that worked and used a supporting cast in very meaningful ways and introduced new places and new characters like Scareglow and the Eternian version of Hell, and they even got to go to the Eternian version of Heaven. And the writing was epic and deep and emotional and just excellent, and it moved the characters forward in a meaningful and logical way. And so I'm not overly surprised that this season feels much more like what I would expect to come out of something made by Mattel TV. And I also know that this was not made in a vacuum. There is a lot of pressure on the people who make this show. And I'm not going to speculate about what effect that had, but I do wonder what would have happened if this had been made under better circumstances. And so in this spoiler review, we're going to be taking this episode by episode, but there are going to be times when I stop to focus on a character's entire arc throughout the series, so I don't have to keep talking about it every episode. I'll be using screen captures from trailers and clips to illustrate what I'm talking about, and if I can't find one of those, I'll just use some artwork from the toy line. And I do think we'll be getting a third season, Masters of the Universe Retribution, or whatever it'll be called. And I guess we'll have to wait a couple years, but judging from the success in both viewership and toy sales that Revelation had and the initial success that Revolution is experiencing in viewership, I would say a third season is probably definitely happening, but we'll talk about what could be in that third season at the end. All right, let's start with a positive note. Episode 1, written by Kevin Smith, is actually really good, as it was a strong start. We begin with a return to Scareglow's realm. This is something that me and a lot of other people expected, that the opening scene would be them raiding Scareglow's realm in order to get the souls of Fisto and Clampjamp, which Skeletor had sent to Hell last season. They do a much better job of defining what Hell is this season and making it look really, really cool. And there's a giant glow-in-the-dark skeleton, and I love this. I wish they would go further. I would love to see a whole glow-in-the-dark faction in the toy line with the Souls of the Damned as figures, just this army glow-in-the-dark figures that follow Scareglow with a glow-in-the-dark steed for Scareglow and a glow-in-the-dark play set. But yeah, I think what we got here was really well done. One thing you're not going to hear me complain about in this review is the animation, the voice acting, or the music. They are all excellent in this series. And the writing in this scene and in the episode overall is pretty darn good and what I would expect from Kevin Smith. One thing I did have some mixed feelings about was our use of the 4 heroic warriors for the season, which is Rio Blast, his first time in animation, Snout Spout, what you see beside of him, Buzz Off, and then Ram Man. And the problem here is that they're not really characters so much as cameos that only last a few seconds per character when they appear. The characters aren't even named in the series, and nothing they do is particularly memorable or special, with the exception of Ram Man. The few seconds he has on screen, he uses them for his signature move, ramming things with his head, which was sorely missing from last season. And it's used in this big over-the-top way where he hits Scareglow harder than He-Man and things like that, which was cool. But unfortunately, he's still used so little that most people probably won't even remember he's in this season. I would have much preferred that these characters be used as characters and not cameos. And the other issue is the horrible puns that Kevin Smith has to make. And for some reason, this is unique to Kevin Smith's writing, where his jokes just become very silly and very juvenile. And I suspect he was probably given some direction for the season he's just overcompensating for. I'm not sure if that's to make it lighter or less sophisticated, but unfortunately you have to suffer through some really bad puns. But some of his humor still works, like the Too Bad cameo was actually really funny, even if it was pointless because he doesn't do anything after that. But Too Bad was voiced by Jason Mewes, who plays Jay from Jay and Silent Bob, and Griffin Newman, who of course voices Orko in this series. Skeletor, played by Mark Hamill, continued to be a delight. Now, he's controlled by Motherboard, but he's not like a zombie. It seems like she's reprogrammed him to serve the Horde willingly, even though he's still a little pissed at Hordak for being such an asshole to him. The deathbed scene with Randor was done very powerfully and very emotionally, and honestly, this episode, for the most part, is written so well, it just felt like the 11th episode of Revelation. If you're wondering, the doctor in the scene is named Mendor, and he was a minor character in the modern DC Comics, and he is voiced by Phil Lamar. And as many of us thought, Teela does bring back Preternia this season, which was the heaven of Eternia that got destroyed in season 1. But it takes her all season, so she goes on this quest, and they do explain why there is a snake tower in heaven. Preternia was created by 3 gods. One is Zoar, represented by the Grayskull Tower. The other is Ka, which is represented by Snake Tower. And then the last is Havoc, which has a curiously missing tower that we learn about later. Maybe that'll be in season 3. And Havoc here is just one of 3 types of magic on Eternia, and just happens to be the type of magic Skeletor uses through his Havoc staff. The ending funeral scene is done in a very powerful way, and it does a great job of setting this up as a coming-of-age story where Adam has to deal with his father's death and taking on the responsibility of what comes next. And then Keldor shows up to create a big sea change in the story and take it in a completely stupid direction. Episode 2, it actually starts with a strong scene, but I don't have a visual for it because it's Randor and Keldor as kids, but it's actually a sympathetic scene. King Miro's wife, Queen Amelia, is played by Harley Quinn Smith. I wish she could have played Alina, who was in the first season but got cut, but it's kind of cool that Kevin Smith got his daughter in there playing the Queen. And let me talk about the other scenes that I liked in the episode while I'm at it. So there is Teela's trip to Darksmoke. This is from the Filmation cartoon, but reimagined for Revolution. And Tim Sheridan, who writes the second episode, he worked on the first season, does some strong writing in this scene as well. This introduces us to the Revolution version of Granomir, who is a great modern upgrade of his Filmation self. I just love what they did with this guy. This is spot on to what I imagined they could have done with him in 2002, that animated series, and I love his entire arc. It's perfect. And I love Lynn's plot line this season. She basically reminds me of Emma Frost from the X-Men, who's a former villain who is like the queen of snark. But it was just so much fun. She was, for the most part, very well written throughout the series, and I loved her arc. We'll talk about her epilogue at the end. And I really liked the technological titan created by the ancients. I thought that was really cool and just a neat idea. It was a pretty solid fight scene, even if it did tie into a plot line or a subplot that I really didn't care for. But even then, it was still neat to see how Skeletor and Keldor could be in the same place at the same time. It's like a magic trick. You know it's fake, but you just want to know how they did it. And there was also a really great scene where Battle Cat and He-Man have a conversation, and I just thought that was really, really cool. It was totally unexpected and caught me by surprise and did make me choke up a little bit. And so the first couple episodes did actually give me some hope and did put some lipstick on the pig, but unfortunately most of the season is devoted to the pig. So let's go ahead and just talk about that right now and rip that Band-Aid off, and that would be the main plot line with He-Man. So He-Man's role this season is to be duped by Keldor, who is played by William Shatner, into giving him the crown of Eternos. Keldor is about as subtle as a sledgehammer in his deceptions and is suspicious as hell, just happening to show up out of nowhere, knowing how to stop the technological titan. All of this stuff just seems way too good to be true. This is made even stranger by Adam not wanting to claim the crown because he does not want to give up being He-Man. First of all, of course, he probably doesn't have to. But second of all, this is a character who last season was defined by his willingness to give up power and his preference of being Adam over He-Man, two things that seem to have been completely forgotten in this season. So there may be some reasons for this. Maybe they did check and verify Keldor's story or his identity somehow between scenes, and maybe Adam's hesitancy to take the crown and gravitation towards Keldor is because he's in the mourning process, right? He just lost his father and wants things to go back to normal, and Keldor provides him a way to go back to having a king and a father figure on that throne again. And last season, they did establish that He-Man does handle the power of Grayskull better than the villains, but it still exaggerates certain parts of his personality, and we did see him being more naive when he was He-Man than when he was Adam. You know, a great example of that is in the final episode of Season 1, where he thinks Skelegod is going to help him in the final battle. But even if there are justifications for it, it's simply not the type of plotline I want to see with He-Man. He's just not the type of character I want to make a mistake that puts the entire world in danger that he has to fix. He's just not that type of character, and he just came off as naive and kind of dense in this season. And to add to this, he seemed helpless when he became Adam in episode 4. He got easily captured. He seemed helpless in the prison cell. And his mother had to remind him that he's He-Man even when he doesn't have his powers. Why? Adam knew he was He-Man without his powers last season. He was a complete and total badass. He was facing down a god without his powers. And then to round out the strangeness, at the end, after he's defeated the enemy and he's just making a speech and just walking off into the sunset, he's still He-Man at the end of the season. It's like he's choosing to live as He-Man instead of Adam, which seems to contradict everything that they established about the character in the first season. It's almost like the first season didn't even matter. Episode 3 opens with Stondar, leader of the Comet Warriors, captured by the Horde and being brought before Hordak. And they've invaded his planet, and he tries to go at Hordak, and he's stopped by Hordak's lieutenants, Leech, Grizzlor, and Mantana. And it's a very effective scene where they defeat him and kill him. And this is a good thing because it shows that they can be menacing. And that's good because they're only going to have one other brief appearance, and that's going to be when Gwildor and Orko kick their ass. This is another instance of them trying to use a named character to kill in order to make the villains more menacing. And it is an effective scene in that sense, but I feel like it was shortchanging Stondar. We never actually got to see him in his comet form, and we never got to see any of his people. I suppose it is possible that the Comet Warriors might show up next season and try to avenge Stondar, but I'm not holding my breath on that happening. Another scene that worked well and another subplot that worked well throughout the series was Gwildor and Orko. This is probably a matchup that is inspired by the comic strip, which had them at odds with each other because one is a scientist and one is a magician, and they try to play it up for laughs, which I didn't find very effective in the comic strip, but it really works here. I like both of these characters. Orko is basically just kind of there to help out in various scenes and doesn't really have an arc, but that's okay. He went through his heavy character arc last season. And Gwildor was straight out of the movie, though unfortunately we didn't see the Cosmic Key or any of his other inventions in action. Unfortunately, got so little screen time. But I do like the way that they expanded the way he was talking about the universe being a series of different chords or tones into what they were doing in that season. Magic is just another chord in the symphony of the universe. I think it would be really neat to see him used in comics or future cartoons. And now that they've established him, since Mattel likes recycling ideas so much, they can use him again. But other than those brief scenes, I had a lot of problems with episode 3. So let's go ahead and get to the other half of that pig, which is the brain damaged Skeletor Keldor plotline, which I will say Mark Hamill and William Shatner knocked out of the ballpark as far as the acting goes. Again, it's just story that I have the problem with. And so now we've got to go through a little bit of convoluted silliness to write off an origin that existed in Masters of the Universe Revelation issue 2, a tie-in comic from back when Revelation came out. In my opinion, this was the best and most badass version of Skeletor's origin to date, and it gave him an incredibly personal reason to hate Hordak and want the power of Grayskull. And clearly they just decided to go in a different direction for this season than what they'd established, and not just the origin, but other aspects of what happened in the issue, including the nature of the Havoc staff and Hordak's relationship to magic. I don't really care they discarded this origin. Obviously, Mattel likes to recycle ideas, and since they like to do it with bad ideas, maybe they can do it with the good ones, and we'll see this come up in another series, movie, or comic. And so Skeletor starts remembering what they say is his true origin after Motherboard gets mad at him and bashes him around to discipline him, and it literally causes some kind of damage to his memory. That's why I call him brain damaged Skeletor. And so he starts remembering, and he starts to see Keldor appear to him and start talking to him. And so they've decided to work off my least favorite version of Keldor's backstory, where he is the bastard brother of Randor, and he cannot take the crown because of that. And he's half Gar, and so in this version, he's sent to live with his mother in the nation of Anwar Gar. So I'm using a Filmation image to illustrate the Horde attacks Eternia and attacks Anwar Gar, and for some reason, Hordak offers to let Keldor join the Horde, and for some reason, Keldor accepts. But what we do know is by the time Hordak is training him, he does have the motivation that this version of Keldor has, where it's, woe is me, I was denied the throne, I must join the Horde, kill my brother, and take over the planet. Hordak wants Keldor to be his magic user, so he gives him the Havoc Staff, and even though Hordak gives it to him, that doesn't necessarily mean the Havoc Staff is Hordak's. Most likely Hordak took it from someplace, maybe the Faceless one. But once Keldor touches the Havoc Staff, it transforms him into Skeletor. And using Filmation to illustrate again, because they recreate the scene in Secret of the Sword for She-Ra's origin, in which Hordak and Skeletor sneak into the royal nursery and steal a baby, which we assume to be baby Adora. But there is also no explanation for the scene. It's visual only, so no one ever says that name. And as much as I love Secret of the Sword, this is one of those scenes I've always haggled with a little bit, Because why would master villains like Hordak and Skeletor steal babies themselves instead of having one of their henchmen do it? And even more unbecoming of Skeletor, he gets his butt kicked and gets captured. And in the Filmation version, he betrays Hordak and gives away his location to save his own skin. Now, that part we don't know about, but that is certainly possible that that could have happened in this version as well. And the reason the Horde invasion and these events haven't come up in either the Revelation cartoon or comics is maybe because of mass memory wiping. In Filmation, Sorceress casts a spell to make everyone forget the Horde and Adora because they didn't want Adam to be sad, which makes no sense to me. How would you make an entire planet forget an invasion, which probably lasted quite a while? And you're going to mess with the mind of everyone on Eternia just so Adam won't be sad because he lost a sister he never met? The weirdest part of it is that Keldor makes brain damaged Skeletor into a character who is solely focused on gaining the throne of Eternia. He is only focused on his grievance in being denied the throne. He even tells Keldor in episode 4 that he doesn't want the power of Grayskull. He just wants the throne. I mean, Skeletor has always wanted both. He wants to rule the planet, but he also wants to be God. That's just who he usually is. Part of me wonders if this was really the result of an accident or if Motherboard maybe intentionally triggered these memories in order to make Keldor a less dangerous villain, right? This is a downgrade, right? He's a lot less dangerous if he's not going after the power of Grayskull and just is infatuated with the throne he lost. But maybe she didn't realize the effect that would have on him and how crazy it would make him. I don't think that's really the case, but that's the best explanation I can come up with. As for why Hordak implanted false memories in Skeletor, Skeletor assumes it's because it would help make him more loyal to Hordak. But of course, that doesn't make any sense. Hordak was betrayed by Skeletor, even with the alleged false memories. And the false memories actually gave him a much more deep-seated reason to hate Hordak and betray him. There is supposed to be an explanation for whatever Hordak's logic was in the upcoming Masters of the Universe Revolution prequel comic that will start in May. All right, let's talk about Teela's subplot. So Revelation set up some very interesting plot lines for her where she's going to be the first sorceress to go outside of Grayskull and try to use Grayskull's secrets to help the world. And so that creates a lot of potential opportunities and problems. And also Adam and Teela express that they have feelings for each other for the first time, setting up a potential relationship. I don't feel like we've got to see either of those things. She does show up as one of many characters to help in the opening scene and then gets kind of sucked into this subplot to try to resurrect Preternia. And it's just an excuse to give her different costumes. And one of them is Green Goddess, which was a separate character originally, but in the DC Comics, they made Teela into the Green Goddess, and so they do it again here. But we don't lose the character. There's no undead Snake Man, so that's good. Once she gets used to it, it's just another costume for her to wear and another color of magic for her to use when the Horde takes over Grayskull and cuts off her power. She does get Havoc magic as well, and we see her as a sorceress of Havoc for a few seconds, and that costume is modeled after Kreta on New Adventures of He-Man. When she gets the power of all three types of magic, she can't handle it, so He-Man shares his power with her, and so now I guess maybe she's technically champion, but she still can do magic, just like we saw with Skeletor and Evil Lyn last season. And so now she used a tri-sorceress with the power of all three different types of magic, and her costume is modeled after the Central Tower of Eternia. As far as a relationship with Adam, there is unfortunately none. Instead, they are just blushing and embarrassed around each other while Teela denies that she has feelings for Adam and that they're anything but friends, while everyone around her is trying to shove a relationship with Adam down her throat. None of this makes any sense with how they ended last season. It accumulates in a kiss that is followed by the dumbest joke in the history of the franchise. And like everything this season that doesn't involve He-Man and Skeletor, it feels like a disposable subplot that they could have left out. And that would have been merciful for Andra if they'd done that, because poor Man-at-Arms gets duped by Keldor into taking technology from Motherboard that turns people into zombies and trying to repurpose it to make the people of Eternia stronger. And oh my God, I cannot describe to you how horrible of an idea that would be, even if He-Man himself had asked that. And the amount of testing and caution that would take place for such a request would be substantial. But somehow they're able to do this in the amount of time it takes He-Man to go to Snake Mountain. And while Andra's being an idiot, He-Man's been tricked into going to Snake Mountain. And this is basically just a montage. It's not really a fight scene. And he uses the battle armor, but it may last maybe like a whole 60 seconds. But it's still neat to see it in animation. And then after that, the Horde invades and Motherboard takes over Grayskull like it's nothing. All right, episode 4, it's the Horde, or the lack thereof. We actually saw every single bit of the Horde they were going to show us this season in the few seconds we saw in the trailer. It's just the ships, the Horde troopers, Hordak, and these 3 guys. That's it. That's all we got. And these guys only briefly appeared in a couple fight scenes, and the only thing they got to do on Eternia was get their ass whooped by Orko and Gwildor. This season just didn't seem all that interested in the Horde. They just felt like they were being shoehorned into someone else's story. And when our heroes should have been fighting the Horde, they spent most of their time fighting brainwashed Eternians. Adam got to fight some Horde troopers, but he never got to fight the Horde as He-Man, which is really strange. Now that they've got the character models for these things designed, maybe we can come back and do some more characters next season and do the Horde for reals. Speaking of wasted potential, Motherboard. Now, she did have a cool death. I will say that the head in the box was kind of awesome, but it is a waste of a character. The way she easily took Castle Grayskull would make her the most powerful character we've ever seen in the Pantheon. And to kill her off that easy between scenes just seemed a little cheap. But if you can't think of anything meaningful to do with the character, I guess at least give them a cool death. And then we have the Hordak Skeletor fight, which was awesome. But unfortunately, because of the way the trailer was done, like just about everything else in this season, we knew how it was going to end. We knew Skeletor would win, and he would be the villain at the end that everyone would have to defeat. So I kind of figured going in that Hordak's only purpose narratively in the story would be to get his ass whooped by Skeletor. But I was hoping that we would get a little bit more out of his character, because really the only thing we know about Hordak is that he likes technology, he likes conquering things, and he likes being an asshole. And I'm not saying he needed the depth that DreamWorks Hordak had in that She-Ra series, but just a little bit more would have been nice. Maybe they can rectify that next season. And since I've already talked about everyone's plot lines earlier in the video, let's just move on to the final episode. Episode 5. So He-Man has his power sword upgraded by Gwildor, and it can now absorb magic, and it gives him this new awesome costume. He uses all this to fight Skeletor, who now is a combination of magic and technology. Where does the magic come from? Evelyn took the Havoc staff. He told her he didn't need it anymore. So maybe the magic is from Grayskull, but when He-Man reverts Grayskull back to normal and, frees it from Horde control, he doesn't lose the magic. So I'm not sure. Logic need not apply. So this fight, is perfectly well choreographed, like always from Powerhouse, wonderfully animated. But I kind of didn't really care about it as much as I cared about the other stuff that was going on in the scene. First of all, this is a fight we've seen a million times across a lot of different medium of these two characters fighting. And last season, there were 3 big fights between He-Man and Skeletor. And He-Man has already beaten this guy last season when he had all the power in the universe. This is kind of anticlimactic at this point, and that's why it would have been so perfect if instead of a He-Man Skeletor story that we had done a traditional Horde story where they team up to fight a greater evil. Plus, I found the dialogue in this scene a little bit grating between He-Man's bad jokes and Skeletor rambling about his damn throne. Skeletor resurrects a bunch of technological titans, which was pretty cool that the other heroes fight. And that includes the Monstroid, which should have been a Horde creature, but unfortunately, here it's just one of those ancient titans, and it barely gets any screen time. The titan that gets the most screen time is the one that fights Granomir, which was kind of awesome. And for some reason, in the middle of the damn battle, they decide heaven can't wait and have Teela, instead of helping them out, bring back Preternia on the spot. But this results in a scene that I predicted last season where all of the fallen champions and the fallen heroes would come back on the battlefield one last time to help against the Titans. And it was actually pretty awesome. Among the spirits that return is Randor, who helps He-Man fight Skeletor, but for some reason does not mention anything about Skeletor being Keldor, which was kind of weird. At the end of the battle, He-Man uses his sword's new ability to drain the power out of Skeletor and turn Skeletor back into Keldor. And then after that, they basically pull a Game of Thrones and dismantle the monarchy. He-Man deals with his colossal mistake of putting Keldor on the throne by basically just deciding to let the people figure out how to govern themselves, and then he leaves to go crash with his girlfriend in her haunted castle. At this point, I could care less one way or the other. And then in the epilogue, we get Zodak finally, and on your right is Strobo, who was an unreleased figure from the vintage line that reused Zodak and Cyclone parts. And to your left is Xanthor, who is from the Filmation episode The Golden Discs of Knowledge. And they make Lyn a cosmic enforcer protecting the balance. So I guess that would make her neutral Lyn. And before we talk about the second epilogue, Dark Horse released this variant cover from the upcoming Masters Universe Revolution comic. Dark Horse claimed that this was a cover showing characters from the animated series, which of course turned out not to be accurate, but what is accurate is that there is indeed a Despara in the final epilogue. Despara originated in the modern DC comics, and she was that saga's version of what Adora was like under Horde control. Now, Rob David has said that he did plan to use a version of Despara who wasn't going to be Adora in the CGI series if it had gotten another season, but of course that didn't happen. Now, the way she's presented here, combined with that scene earlier where we saw a baby that looked an awful like Adora, probably does mean that this is most likely Adora, and that most likely they have cut a deal with DreamWorks to have her appear in the same cartoon as He-Man for the first time in over 3 decades. Now, they are not confirming this, right? They are not announcing this yet, but that would be my assumption, but I would caution you to wait until there is an official announcement and confirmation of this. If this happens, this would be the equivalent of what Marvel did when they cut the deal with Sony to get Spider-Man in the MCU, so let's keep our fingers crossed that Mattel has equal amounts of luck. Now, going back to the scene, Despara mentions Horde Prime when she's talking to Hordak's unconscious body as it's healing, saying that Horde Prime will heal him and then they'll go to Eternia to get revenge. It sounds like she could be talking in third person, but I think it's just awkwardly written. I think Horde Prime is probably who we think he is, and he is normally the emperor of the Horde Empire and is normally over Hordak, and that would be my assumption as to what she's referring to. So if they're able to use Adora and She-Ra next season, the most obvious thing I can think of for the way to go into that would be for Keldor, who is now in Grayskull's basement, to say to He-Man, like, hey, you have a sister you don't know about, and I can help you find her. And there's several different ways that She-Ra's origin has been done in the past. One would be for He-Man to go to Etheria looking for She-Ra, and they do some kind of modern version of Secret of the Sword, which was her original Filmation origin, or they could do something more like the comics, where there's a Horde invasion with Despara in it, and they eventually discover that she's Adora, and she turns on the Horde and becomes She-Ra. I will say the comic could get bleak and didn't really explore much of Eternia, Etheria, or the Horde, and had She-Ra only as a supporting character. If they did She-Ra, I would hope it would be a story like Secret of the Sword that focused on her, the world she lives in, the characters that are her friends and her enemies. But unfortunately, after this season, I kind of expect it probably will end up being more like the comics, but hopefully they'll surprise me. But I know there are a lot of talented, passionate people who love the franchise who were working on this season, and I just unfortunately didn't care for some of the stuff. But honestly, it kind of felt like a filler season, and next season they'll kind of do all the things that should have been done this season, right? With the Horde and Adam and Tila and things like that. And, this season just felt like it had a lot of, course correction for perceived problems and a lot of changes in direction. But I'm super glad for everyone who loved every single thing about this season, and I am looking forward to seeing what they have in the future because every season is another chance to get it right. And regardless, I just love the fact that more and more Masters Universe stuff is getting out there, and I will be reviewing the prequel comic when it comes out starting in May. All right, like and subscribe for more videos, and until next time, good journey.